Hi guys, so after a long wait, our good friend Jacob Rees-Mogg appeared on LBC. Now unfortunately it wasn't James O'Brien's show, it was Nick Ferrari's. Nick supports Brexit, or at least he used to, so the Brexit Opportunities Minister was somewhat challenged by his host, but not as robustly as we all would have hoped. Anyway, there are a number of very interesting calls that Jacob received, and this is one of the more fundamental, it could be argued, when it comes to Brexit. In 2020, during the negotiations for the TCA, fish and fishing were the talk of the town, and while it represented something as large as the lawnmower industry, it was a standard that was carried into battle by the likes of Mogg and other Brexiteers. The problem is that fishermen, like others, were thrown under a bus, and Mogg was challenged over this by someone who has worked in the industry for about 50 years. Have a listen.
Now, given that the fresh, live fish and shellfish export industries have greatly suffered through the additional red tape and expenses encumbering them post-Brexit, do you believe, A, it is acceptable to leave these industries deal with these huge encumbrances on their own? B, do you think it is advisable that the UK fisheries trade deficit should continue on its current downward spiral? And C, can I please discuss your answers with you on air?
Stand by.
Well, you are discussing...
That last one was addressed to me, I think.
I see, yes, you are discussing on air. So, Robin, thank you for calling in. The issue here is, of course, that the rules that the EU applies on the UK are not under our control.
So much for taking back control. So you told people... Now, why didn't you tell people in the run-up to the referendum in 2016? When we leave, we will not have control over these rules. You didn't tell people that, but now that's the case.
So they have a freedom to apply rules to us, and we do to them.
But you are reliant upon them. The fishing industry is deeply reliant upon the European market. You used to be part of the decision-making process, but that's over now.
But we obviously want to support the fishing industry and support it by the fact that it has new independence and that independence will grow because there is a temporary scheme to allow continued foreign fishing, but that will end eventually. And
No, it will not end. It will be renegotiated in 2026. It will not end. So, this is a problem here also with Nick Ferrari. He doesn't call Jacob Rees-Mogg out on these things. Mogg says something, and he's not challenged on it.
And so it's about ensuring that the British fisherman is able to get to the best stocks in UK territorial waters. And ultimately, if the EU or member states of the EU want to import these goods, they will need to make it reasonable to do so. And they have made some ameliorations to their rules since we finally left, because they actually want to buy these goods. And so it becomes market forces that determine what the level of regulation becomes.
So they are the ones making the decisions, not the UK industry, not UK politicians. Once again, this was all about taking back control. We're going to be able to access all these fishing waters and there'll be no consequences. We're going to be able to sell them into the EU as we could before. But that was obviously a lie. Or Jacob Rees-Mogg and Nigel Farage and others didn't know what they were talking about. Well, which is it? It was a lie, or you were ignorant of reality?
But initially, we have to remember the EU was very cross that we'd left, and they wanted to make life as difficult as possible.
You decided to put up barriers between yourself and your biggest market. Does anyone actually believe this? I know some people who are still with their scarves wrapped around their necks for Brexit still believe this, that it was the EU is doing this to punish Britain. But these have been rules that have been in place. One of them I was talking about since, I think it was 2007 or 2008. So while the UK was a member, a lot of these rules came in, and some of them go back even decades. So it's not a case of, well, we're going to do this to punish Britain. Jacob Rees-Mogg knows this, he's lying, and unfortunately he's not been called out on it.
Robin, how long have you been in the fishing industry, sir?
I've been in the fishing industry 50 years.
Can I ask you, since Brexit, has it got better? Has it got worse? Was it roughly where it was before, and why?
Well, basically, I disagree with Jacob's summary of that, because basically EU regulations and laws have been in place for over 2 decades, which includes any third country, which we have now become since we've left the EU. These rules and regulations are to guarantee food security and food standards. The standards that they hold are still the same as before Brexit. The standards that we hold now have had to change because basically, A, we have polluted waters, which the government voted to continue putting raw sewage into our inland seas and estuaries. This has grossly affected the water quality. We now have 90% of British waters are classified B, not A, which means they have to be depurated before they can be sent abroad, and it causes immense problems on paperwork.
Will you accept as someone a lifetime in the industry? He's saying it's not as good as it was. Brexit has made it worse. Jacob Rees-Mogg, why is he wrong and you're right?
No, what I am saying, what I'm going to say, is that the EU regulations have always been a form of protectionism, that the UK industry is not fundamentally less safe than it was before we left the European Union. The water...
A protectionism for member states. It protects industries in the single market. You wanted out of the single market and the customs union. Jacob Rees-Mogg in 2019 was campaigning, it seems, was very happy to leave without a deal, which would have imposed tariffs as well. This is somebody who was saying everything is going to be great for the fishing industry. Now we've just heard from somebody who's worked in the fishing industry for 50 years saying it's a disaster. The EU puts certain restrictions on stuff coming in from outside the single market. The UK is now, or Great Britain I should say, is outside the single market. So it's been treated like every other country outside the single market. You can complain about this, but you told people, Jacob Rees-Mogg, you told people that it will be fine, that everything will be wonderful.
Quality is designated on the same basis as it was before we left the European Union. Actually, the Environment Act tightened up the rules on what water companies could do. So they've got stricter rather than laxer since we left the European Union.
But you're not imposing those restrictions. The problem is not the rules, it's the implementation of those rules. It's the enforcement, I should say, of those rules. You can set whatever standards you want, but if you're not enforcing them, if companies are able to pump raw sewage into the sea and not get fined, not get punished, then they'll do it. It doesn't matter what the standard is, if the standard is not enforced.
But the EU uses non-tariff barriers as a means of protecting domestic markets, and that's what it's always done. That was one of the problems with the EU.
He's trying to tell people who used to be able to export into the EU, because the UK was a member state, that was a problem. And now so you were able to export without problems, but that was a problem. Now that you have a problem to export, that is the solution. Really?
Because it forces prices up for consumers.
So finally,
because it forces prices up for consumers. So when we were in the single market, it was more expensive. Now that we're outside the single market, it's cheaper. But it's not cheaper. It's the opposite. It's more expensive. Because if you're importing stuff, you have to pay more. There are customs declarations. There's all the paperwork that has to be completed. This is a cost. This is passed on to the consumer. This was not necessary before. So you can't say it's by leaving the single market it's going to be cheaper. It's more expensive by simple logic.
You're saying the British fishing industry is healthier as a result of Brexit than it was a number of years ago.
What I'm saying is that the standards applied in food production in this country have not deteriorated since we left the European
Union.
Union.
Industry.
But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you have the same standards as the European Union. You are a third country. Why is this so difficult for people to understand? You could have exactly the same standards as the European Union. But if you're a third country, you will be treated differently because you're not part of the single market. It's like, once again, I hate to go back to this analogy, but you're a member of a tennis club or a football club or whatever. Even if you do exactly the same things as the people inside the club, you won't have the same privileges as the people inside the club. You have to be a member. Surely Jacob Rees-Mogg is a member of some association or something like that. I'm not a member of that association. Can I have the same privileges as him? No, I can't, because I'm not a member. Doesn't matter what I do, as long as I'm not in that club, I'm not going to have the privileges of that club.
Be healthier.
And hold on, and water quality is actually improving, and those regulations were tightened in the Environment Act. But I absolutely accept Robin's point that the EU is applying non-tariff barriers to make life difficult for British fishermen.
This is frustrating. The EU is imposing non-tariff barriers to make it difficult for British fishermen. Why does he continue to lie all the time? The fisherman, I forget his name, said this has been the case for 2 decades. It's been like this for 2 decades. So how is it punishing Britain? This is all just to throw red meat to Brexit supporters. This is just to keep those people happy. Because he knows that he has to come up with something. Well, I can't actually come up with a benefit, so I have to just continue to pump out the rhetoric that the EU hates us, the EU is angry that we left, the EU is punishing us.
But that is because of the doctrine of the European Union. It is not because of the doctrine of the UK government.
So it is tougher to be a fisherman or fisherwoman as a result of the EU's activities?
Hold on, it depends entirely on the circumstances and which market you're dealing with, because some of our own waters we now have more access to.
Right.
But there are some barriers, non-tariff barriers to trade that the EU has imposed.
Has imposed. No, imposed on third countries for decades. It's important to remember that Jacob Rees-Mogg told these people, you need to leave, we need to vote to leave in order to be able to cut prices, to be able to have cheaper food, cheaper clothes, cheaper of everything. Everything would be cheaper if we left the European Union and left the single market and the customs union. That's important to remember. He was selling 2 things, leave the EU and the single market and the customs union. Because leaving the EU did not require leaving the single market and the customs union. Now, it's complicated, but it's not necessary. It was not necessary. And it was not on the ballot. There was nothing about the single market and the customs union. Some people try to say, well, that was part of everything. Because there were people like Daniel Hannan, Brexiteer, just like Jacob Rees-Mogg, who was talking about, well, no one's talking about leaving the single market and the customs union. But we're supposed to believe that Brexiteers knew what they were voting for. So here we have it. Jacob Rees-Mogg telling the fishing industry that the problem was the EU, that the EU was driving up prices, and now that these industries are struggling to export, and some of them have just given up. Some of these fishing, some aspects of the fishing industry have just given up because it's no longer possible. He's trying to tell them that yes, this is in some way beneficial. Let me know in the comment section, guys, what you think about all of this. As always, your comments are greatly appreciated. Thanks a lot.